Hi, this is DK Marley, the Hisfic Chickie, and I'm happy to welcome VEH Masters to the show today with her fabulous new book, The Castilians. While many might think that the title that this is set in Spain, it isn't. This is the story of the siege of St. Andrew's Castle in Scotland, a time in Tudor history that, honestly, I knew very little about and was thrilled to read about in Vicky's story. VEH Masters was born and grew up on a farm just outside of St. Andrews in Scotland. She's been fascinated by the siege of St. Andrews Castle ever since her history teacher took the class on a visit, which included going down the siege tunnel dug out of rock in 1546 and peering into the bottle dungeon where Cardinal Beaton's body is said to have been kept, pickled in salt, for over a year. When she learned that the group who took the castle and held it for over 14 months, resisting the many attempts to retake it, called themselves the Castilians, she knew even then it was the perfect title for a story. She's lived for most of her life nearby, and St. Andrews is one of her two favorite places in the world. She now lives between Pickled and Peebles, which are both pretty amazing towns too. The Castilians is her debut novel, and she's currently working on a sequel. I was very fortunate to do an editorial review on the book, which I will share later in the show. For now, I'd like to thank you, Vicky, for being on the show, and for the first question, we would love to know what literary pilgrimages you have been on.
When I was 11, my aunt took me to London. It's the first time I'd ever been to London, only the second time ever outside Scotland. It was terribly exciting.
Wow.
And I, such a bee in my bonnet, I wanted to find the old curiosity shop. I've no idea why I thought that Charles Dickens had based his book on an actual shop, or even why I thought it would still be there more than 150 years later. But I dragged my poor aunt all over London looking for it. And eventually what we found was, of course, not the real thing. It was so disappointing.
Yeah.
My second literary pilgrimage was more successful, again, also with my aunt, when we went to Abbotsford House in the Scottish borders, which was the home of Sir Walter Scott. And he had it built for him, and it was designed with all Scots Gothic drama. But what was truly enjoyable was to follow the carriage ride that he did every day and sit at what is still called Scots View and look out over the hills.
Oh.
And of course, I've been to Burns's cottage, Robert Burns's cottage. But probably the most evocative place I've ever been to is the battle site of Culloden. And this was before they glammed it up and made a visitor centre, and it is the bleakest place of this terrible battle that absolutely destroyed the Scottish clan system. So very powerful place to go to, at least it was then.
Oh, I can imagine. It was. I've never been there, but I'm sure it's been glammed up and a lot of visitors because of the Outlander series, but that can be amazing to go to places like that. So let's get into a little bit about writing, and we would love for you to tell us about your best writing tip that you can think of, and it's something that helps you and something that might help another writer starting out.
I set a timer so that I write in 30-minute bursts, and I'm not supposed to get up from my desk nor to investigate social media on my computer or look at the news or anything else, check emails. And it works mostly. It's quite a discipline for me, though.
I think that's a really good advice to do, little bursts like that. Thank you for sharing that. Well, what do you think are some of the common traps for aspiring writers? Any advice you can give for young writers starting out?
Personally, I think there's too much advice out there, and it's actually very easy to end up in overwhelm. But anyway, I'll give a piece of advice. My advice is to trust to your intuition and go with what works for you.
That's really good advice. I wish we had all had that kind of advice, because you're right. You do get a little overwhelmed at times. Well, what about you? If you could tell your younger writing self anything, what would it be?
You'll get there eventually. although you'll be pretty old before you do. Just relax and enjoy the journey of life, for everything comes at its own season. Either that, or I might say to my younger self, stop procrastinating and get on with it.
For sure. I think we could all tell ourselves that, even whether we're younger or older. Well, can you tell us a little bit about what other authors you're friends with, and how do you think they help you become a better writer?
I've been fortunate enough to have two amazing writers mentor me. The first was Leslie Glaister, and the second was Margaret Ski, who was recently on your podcast, I believe.
Yes.
They're both award-winning writers, and they really helped and guided me a lot. And Margaret, although she was initially traditionally published, is latterly been self-published. So she's been very generous in guiding me through what is quite a complex area of learning how to indie publish.
Right, yeah. Isn't that amazing to have, it's kind of like this whole community of historical fiction authors that all support each other. I think that's really amazing. Well, can you give us a quick review of a favorite book by one of your author friends?
Leslie Glaister's most recent novel is very evocative. It's set at the very end of the First World War, and her main protagonists inevitably are suffering from post-traumatic stress, although it was completely unrecognised then. And so there is a bit of despair, but there's also some hope. And I am a sucker for a happy ending. And I realise I've forgotten to mention the name of the novel, which is Blasted Things. So it's Leslie Glaister's Blasted Things.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that with everyone. I always like to do that because it kind of gives everybody an idea of what we as authors read and what kind of things we like to read. Do you think that publishing your first book changed your process of writing or not?
It changed my self-belief more than anything. When I got the first few good reviews and the book was shortlisted for a couple of small prizes, I felt so much more confident about my writing and my ability to do what I'd always dreamed of doing. And so writing no longer feels like some sort of indulgence that I'm slightly embarrassed by. It's what I do.
Right. Yeah, that definitely comes along with as you start getting good reviews in, it definitely boosts your confidence in your writing. I can totally concur with that. Well, as a writer, what do you think is the best money you've ever spent, and something that kind of give an idea to young writers starting out about where they can best spend their money?
Well, mentoring, of course, was money very well spent.
Oh, wow.
But like many of the people that have spoken on your podcast, investing in editing is really critical.
Right.
And I certainly notice the difference in indie publishing between a book that has been professionally edited and one that has not. And it is unfortunate that it's usually all too evident if professional editing has not been invested in. And of course, things like a good book cover and your website are important. But I'm fortunate in that my husband is a designer.
Oh,
so
wonderful.
He very patiently does all that work for me.
That's nice. Yeah, I can agree with you on the book cover design. I spent 35 years as a graphic designer, so I think investing in book cover design is a very good way to spend your money. And editing, of course. Well, what do you think is the best way to market your book? Because this is something that a lot of authors struggle with. So we'd love to know what your advice is on this.
Do a little marketing every day is my mantra. At the moment, I'm trying to learn Amazon ads. And it is a steep learning curve.
Right.
But I'm beginning to see sales rising, especially in other territories in the United Kingdom, in your part of the world, for instance, and in Canada. So there's a lot to learn there.
Right.
My daughter-in-law has got very interested in what I'm doing, which is great to have somebody alongside you. And so she helps out with social media, and she's always prompting me that I need to get a post up or a blog out. And contacting other bloggers, because you need to get your book reviewed, otherwise nobody knows about it. And I have found that people like yourself have been very generous to somebody that is a new and relatively unknown author. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're very welcome. And that's my total intention of creating the website at the Historical Fiction Company. I've had so much support over my years of learning to become a published author, and I wanted to pay it back in some way, and I feel like developing this website is the best way that I can do this, to offer a whole range of things. As far as your book, I would love to know more about your research process. How long do you usually research, and what kind of research did you have to do for this book?
For my book, The Castilians, which is based on actual events that happened in St Andrews in Scotland in 1546, I did huge amounts of research. And I couldn't go to one book or document that covered the whole of the siege. There's bits of it mentioned in lots of different documents. And I was very anxious to get it as accurate as I possibly could.
Right.
St Andrews is a university town, as well as famously the home of golf.
Right.
And I had this picture in my head of my book lying in the local bookshop for sale, and an academic from the university coming in, picking it up, flicking through it, and just tossing it to one side, going, this is rubbish, this person hasn't done their work properly at all. So I was very anxious to get it right. In the end, Dr. Bess Rhodes from the university was part of my launch, and the period I'm writing about is her period of research. So it gave me a huge amount of confidence that she joined us. Having read my book, she was happy to join us. My current historical novel takes up where the previous one left off. I'm much more relaxed this time about what I'm doing. And I have done a fair bit of research, but I tend to work on it and then I'm thinking I need to develop this a bit more, or I'm not quite sure the accuracy of what I'm saying. So I'll go back in and check. So I've grown in confidence as time's gone on.
That's good. Yeah, I have found that my research kind of varies from book to book as well. Well, this next question I really love because it's kind of different. So I'd love to know what your thoughts are on this. Do you view writing as sort of a spiritual practice?
Visceral more than spiritual. I need to have a strong connection with what I'm writing about. Otherwise, I'm just not interested enough to write about it, I think. And I grew up in St Andrews. Well, I grew up on a farm outside it. And my grandparents lived in the town. I went to school there. It's where I hung out. I feel a very strong connection with it. And a great deal of interest in this story that I'm telling, which I first heard about as a child.
That's amazing. You have connections like that. I feel the same way about some of the different places that I've visited in England, especially like Stratford-upon-Avon, different places in London. So I definitely understand that. Well, have you read anything that has made you think differently about fiction? We would love to know your thoughts on that.
I've recently read Stephen King's book on writing.
Oh, yes.
A few people had recommended it to me, but I felt kind of resistant to reading it, to be honest. I often find when I read books about the process of writing that it has the opposite effect on me. I emerge kind of frozen, like I really don't know how to write, or just feeling it's all too complicated and a little bit joyless. But King's book was wonderful. I completely related to a lot of what he had to say. It felt like he writes he has a similar approach to me. I just felt a connection with what he had to say.
Yes.
And I loved how he speaks about things like mining the fossils.
Yeah.
It's a bit like the visceral I spoke about earlier. And another tip that he had is after the first draft, and he only writes 2 drafts. I find that amazing.
Yes.
He puts the book to one side and he doesn't look at it for at least 6 weeks. So he comes back to it with fresh eyes, and I think that's a really good tip. So it was very interesting to me to read that book because I'm not a Stephen King reader. I flicked through one of his books because I actually don't really like horror. It scares me.
Right, me too.
But I would recommend that one, definitely.
I absolutely, that is one of the books that I have on my shelf that I will forever always refer back to. I think that is amazing. Everybody needs that book. Stephen King's On Writing, and also the book Bird by Bird. That's another one by Anne Lamott. That's another one that I just highly recommend. So I'm so glad you brought that up because that is one of my favorite ones as well. Well, this next question is, let's see, let me get back to my notes. What do you think about the ethics of writing about historical figures? I know you had some in your book, so we would love to know what you think the ethics are.
I do the research, form my own interpretation, and try to come to a balanced view. With the story of the siege of St Andrew's Castle, we were actually told about that in school, but it was a very one-sided telling. We were told about it from the perspective of the group who take the castle by force, murder its cardinal, and hold it for 14 months. And they were the goodies, because they were the Protestants,
Right.
and we were growing up in a Protestant community. And Cardinal Beaton, who is murdered by them, is the baddie because he's burned a preacher at the stake. But of course it's much more complicated than that.
Right.
And the Castilians themselves actually were very far from good guys. They didn't behave themselves particularly well, and they were actually pensioners of Henry VIII, which we were never told about.
So let's get into a little bit about book reviews. Do you read your book reviews, and how do you deal with the bad ones or with the good ones?
I do read them all, and a couple have given me ideas and suggestions for what they'd like to see in the sequel, which is great, and which I'm taking forward. I love it when readers want to chat to me, and I'm really happy when they do so, particularly through the readers group that I have. So if anybody wants to join that, do feel free to sign up on my website for stories and updates and little tales about the research that I do on VEHmasters.com.
Yes, please, everyone go and please sign up for that so y'all can follow along as she comes up with the sequel to the Castilians, which we're all waiting for. Well, what do you think is the most difficult part of your artistic process? I know we all have a difficult part, so what do you think yours is?
I find the first draft quite a slog, I have to admit. I set myself a target of a word count every day, and I have to sit there until it's done. And some days it's done quickly, and some days, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, having started at 7 o'clock in the morning, I can still be footering around not having done the word count for the day. But I'm quite strict with myself, just to get on and get it done.
Right. Yeah, I think we can all relate to that very, very well. Well, now I'm going to just open up the floor to you. We would love for you to tell us about your novel and why you wrote about this particular topic.
The first in series, which is called The Castilians, tells the story of the siege of St Andrew's Castle, Scotland, in 1546, through the eyes of a brother and sister, children of a local merchant in St Andrews. The brother, Will, is with the besiegers inside the castle, and they want religious reform, but they're also running wild in the town. His sister Bethia, outside, is trying to persuade her brother to get out of the castle, to come home, because their family very likely will lose everything if it's discovered he's part of the group. It's treasonous, the activities that he's undertaking. And to save the family, her father is pushing her towards a most unwelcome marriage. So she particularly wants him out. And the backdrop to the story is King Henry VIII of England's determination to force a marriage between Mary, Queen of Scots, who's an infant at the time, she's only 3 years old, and his son Prince Edward, because he wants to control Scotland. And he has connections and is trying to support these Castilians inside the castle. So he's trying to bludgeon Scotland into submission. The second book in the series, now called The Conversos, takes up within the hour, virtually, to where the first one leaves off. And it's due out on St Andrew's Day, which is the 30th of November of this year.
Oh,
so
exciting.
I'm working hard on that at the moment.
Oh, it's exciting. Thank you for sharing that. We're all looking forward to that. Everybody read The Castilians so you can prepare yourself for the next one in the series. So tell us, what is your favorite line or passage from your own book?
There are a number of passages I particularly like, I'm glad to say. But anyway, here's a few lines from one. "Come on," her little brother whispers. "I can show you the best hiding place ever. Even God won't find you there." Bethia slides off the bed and follows him, the wedding dress swinging in the draught as she closes the door behind her.
Yeah, that's great. Well, now you've told us what your favorite line or passage is. Can you tell us what the hardest scene was for you to write?
It wasn't a scene so much as the blurb, which goes on the back cover.
Oh, yes.
And up on the sites like Amazon, and is absolutely critical for somebody to read through it and go, oh yeah, that's a book I'd like to read. And oh my goodness, have I struggled with it.
Yes.
Without exaggeration, I must have spent about 3 weeks working on it, and I still don't think it's right. So yes, that's been definitely the hardest thing I've had to do in the whole process.
Isn't that amazing? I think we all can agree with that. We can write a whole 100,000 word novel, but when we get down to the blurb, we're all like, wait, what? We don't know what to do anymore. It's so relatable. We can so relate to that. Thank you for sharing that. Well, now we've come down to the last question. We've enjoyed having you here so much. And this last question, I really like to ask because it really kind of shows a little insight into the author themselves. So can you tell us what your favorite quote is? Not from your, not particularly from your book, but a favorite quote and why that tells us a little bit about you.
I watched an interview with the singer Ed Sheeran not that long ago. And the interviewer said to him, "Of course, you're very talented." And I loved Sheeran's reply. He said, perseverance is much more important than talent. Perseverance and work. And this was a man who spent 5 years sleeping on people's floors before he became successful. It wasn't an instant overnight success. And now he is, without doubt, one of the most successful singers in the world. And it's taken me a very long time to understand that writing is really 95% perspiration and 5% inspiration.
Right.
So Sheeran's quote really resonated with me, and I wrote it down, slapped it up on my desk, and it's there every day to remind me that perseverance is the thing.
That's good. Thank you so much for sharing that. That is absolutely true. And we appreciate having you here so much, Vicki. And for all the listeners, you can go to the website at www.thehistoricalfictioncompany.com. Click on the bookshop and you will find her book on the P through O first aisle, or you can go to amazon.com. And now I would love to share my editorial review of the book. The year is 1546, and Scotland is under attack from Henry VIII, determined to marry his son Edward to the infant Mary, Queen of Scots. A few among the Scottish nobles, for both political and religious reasons, are eager for this alliance as well. The story begins with a brutal killing, a necessary one in the eyes of those seeking this union, as they kill Cardinal Beaton, Mary's great protector, in retaliation for the burning of George Wishart, an advocate for the new Protestant faith, and they capture St. Andrew's Castle with the hopes of a rescue from the King of England. While you expect this story to cleave to the historical details, which it does with great finesse, this actually becomes a story about a brother and sister, two young people trying to find their way in the midst of the political and religious upheaval surrounding them. Will is one of the Castilians, fighting for the Protestant cause, even as he is disturbed at the horrific handling of Beaton's murder, and questions the tactics on more than one occasion. But he is loyal, and this is his strong suit during the entire story. Even though his actions bring a shadow over his family, a family still caught in the middle of faithfulness to Rome, and listening to the powerful words of zealots like John Knox. Bethia, his sister, suffers from her brother's actions in that her father thinks to marry her off quickly before anyone discovers that his son Will is party to the uprising. He is a man willing to use his daughter as a financial pawn, attaching her to a man who might give the family a bit of clout, and ignoring any thought of his daughter's wishes. Such was the way in the time period when women were viewed as mere chattel. Loyalty is a huge theme in this novel. How hard will you fight for something you believe in? So often Will is given the chance to escape, oftentimes urged by his sister Bethia, but his religious convictions remain powerful, even as his strength withers away in the midst of sickness, disease, and starvation. Bethia's loyalty to her brother in trying to protect him brings her to the brink of her own struggle for survival. Ultimately, both of them must make choices that set them on their future course, which also sets the stage for more novels to follow in their journey, I hope, and as we have just heard, upcoming in November. The historical events of the siege of St. Andrew's Castle and the murder of Cardinal Beaton is a story I did not know much about, since so many historical novels lean more towards the spectacular court of Henry VIII and his 6 wives, and I applaud Miss Masters for taking on this story. I also loved that she used the point of view of these two young people, adding details about a typical Scottish family during the time period, day-to-day concerns and pursuits, and their own worries when it came to politics and religion. Teenagers in Tudor Scotland transforming into strong adults with sturdy opinions about their own future and the future of Scotland. What a great setting! The use of Scottish words and phrasing added a great flair to the book, perfect authenticity, and made the characters come alive from the page. I enjoyed this aspect very much. My only critical analysis is the use of the present tense voice. I must admit that I'm not a huge fan of this type of writing. Sometimes I was quite thrown off by this, especially in the beginning when I felt myself having to push through the story in order to get to the thick of things. After settling in to the narrative, I started to enjoy the story, and more so upon reaching Bethia's struggle to escape the castle. This descriptive passage was enthralling and gripping, well worth the effort of pushing through the choice of tense choice. Another aspect I enjoyed was the comparison of the two religious men in the novel, John Knox and Cardinal Beaton. You see two religious devotees from the perspective of these two teenagers, of a man steeped in hypocrisy with his mistresses and bastards, carried from place to place with his brash four-poster bed and red papal robes, against the red-faced, spittle-spraying, trumpeting, wordy speeches of a zealot, neither of which you might think engender endearment to their side of the church aisle, yet they do, somehow. We are given a commoner's glimpse into the splitting of God and worship in 16th century Scotland, along with the gruesome details of what each side was willing to do to push forward their ideas. Stake burning and fear on one side, and revolution, reformation, and murder on the other. All of this is developed very successfully and flanked by the search for love in the midst of all this chaos. Bethia and her friend Elspeth eye each young man as a future prospective husband, just as any young teenage girl would do, giggling over the pros and cons of each, and the soft storyline of Bethia and her first crush brings a sweetness to the harsh realities around them. But, as with most teenage romances, both girls suffer heartbreak and the consequences of their actions, as well as the choices of their family. The outcome after the siege of St. Andrews for both Will and Bethia is surprising and one I dare not give away. Readers looking for a different story about Tudor history will enjoy this well-written tale. Thank you to everyone who listened to the show today, and your support is always appreciated. And stay tuned in the next week as we will be interviewing book couture author Megan Masterson. This is DK Marley, the Hisfig Chickie, hoping you all have a great day.